So we've used our Angular CLI to set up a simple site, get it launched, running. Pretty well for us. And we've made a few changes. We've changed the HTML, we've moved the CSS out of our HTML file, we've changed the title in our index file, and we've changed the title property of our app component. So we're going to define some other stuff in our app component. Okay, let's see. What do we want to do here? We're going to define a game class. And we'll say that a game has an ID, which is a number, and it has a title, which is a string. So now inside our app component, let's create a game object. We'll give it an ID and what's a game you'd like to play. It doesn't like the white space here. So now we want to go back to our HTML and we want to render this game object. Within the component itself, yeah, it doesn't like it. Let's see. Okay, so let's go to our app component.html, and now let's render, and maybe in an HTML heading tag, let's render the game title. So I'm going to go down, kind of below everything that's here. So I'll put on maybe an H1, we'll try it. And now we can use our handlebars tag. And it recognizes the title property of my component. If I type game dot. So now we automatically get here heading with the name of our game. Olu, you have a question? Okay, so we defined a class, we made a public class here, and then within our component, we created a game property of type game, and we populated the properties. So that would be how we might show a single game. Maybe we want something a little more than just a single. We're going to change this to be an array of games. So I'm going to keep my class, but up here we're going to define, so we'll create an in-memory array of games. So I use let. Games. So it'll be an array of game objects. So our first, sorry, that needs to be square brackets because in an array. Let me just fix that. So square brackets. And then in here we'll make an array. What's another game you like to play? Okay, somebody else, what's the most recent game you played? Who's played a game today already? Sorry? Okay, I knew somebody would have played something. Okay, and it's warning us, okay, you've defined this games array, but you haven't used it. So we see the difference with TypeScript, that we're creating an array, but we're creating an array of strongly typed objects. This is what JavaScript doesn't allow us to do. We could create an array, but it's just an untyped array. So now we'll replace this, rather than passing a single game, let's pass the whole thing. Hang on, just a minute. We'll see if I do it this way. That's interesting. It's saying create class. We created a game class. We have an array. Bear with me for a sec. There's a simple fix. In our component, hang on, we'll fix it. What are we missing? If I use a different name, does this work? Well, see what's going on in my terminal. Why is it telling us that games is being used like a type? Same issue. Okay, bear with me for a second. I'm just going to comment this out and make sure it. Yes, one other interesting about TypeScript. If you put in a comment, you must put a space after the comment tag. Notice up here, the default comment, I put in comment here, you can put in a space. I have to figure out why this isn't working. It should be working. Well, we don't want it to be const because we later will want to use the UI to update it. So I don't want it to be const. I want to use let. Yes, I could use var. But it's still not solving my issue here. It's being used as a type. So what's going on? We don't want to. Okay, I'm going to ignore this. We're just going to try it anyway. So I'm going to go back to my app component. So instead of my outputting our single title, we're going to use a loop. So I'm going to create a list. And in here, we're going to use an Angular directive, which is star ng4. So we use let game of games. So this is like an Angular for each loop. And then for the moment, we'll just output, let's say, the game.id. We want to loop through using an ng4. So games is the full object. And the current item in the loop is game. But we don't have it loading. So it should just say 1, 2, 3. So yours is working, mine is not. Okay, bear with me for a second. So yours works. I don't think mine's going to work, but we'll figure out why. Well, it says that games refers to a value but is being used as a type. Ah, that's why. There we go. So it quickly recompiles. It reloads automatically. And now we've got 1, 2, 3 so far. Because my loop is displaying game.id. So we want to add some more wrapping around this. I'm going to put this could have been. Bear with me for a second. So I'll put the ID in a span tag, and then underneath we'll output the game dot. So if I save, I should now get the ID. And by the time I go back, it's right here. In the app component, so I created a class with a capital G. So then my array is of that type. It's an array of game objects. Yeah, so we're exporting with the tag of approot, which we see here. So that renders the component where we've got this HTML tag where it matches the selector of approot. So those have to match to load this component. And then our component uses the HTML in this file and the CSS in that file. So let's also make it so that we can click on any game and it'll open up a little form and we can actually change the name of the game. And Angular will allow us to do this in real time without any kind of save or submit. So what I'm going to do is go back to my HTML. So underneath our list, we'll make a section. And we only want this section to be visible when the user clicks on a game. So we can use ngIf, and we can check for a selected game. And that's going to throw an error because we didn't have this property yet. So we need to define a selected game property in our component. That'll make this error go away. So only if we have a value for selected game will this section be visible. Go back to my component, and we're going to add another property to the component. So we're going to have a selected game property which is of type game. So that property may be null, or it may contain one of the elements in our array. When our page first loads, it's null. We have no selection. So if I go back now, my red error turns purple because we've now defined a selected game attribute. Okay, so we just added it in our app component. So any property we add to the component, we can then reference in our HTML. So now let's make a little mini form here. I'll put in a heading. I'll put in field set, have a label. This is ID. We're going to have an input. And we want to bind this input to the ID property. So it's dynamic. Remember, it's two-way data binding. So to do this, we're going to use this tag. And this is going to require an import of the Angular Forms module. So this ng model allows us to bind an input to a value. So if we update the input, the value changes. And if the value changes, the value displayed in the input also changes. So we're going to use ng model. And our ng model is going to be our selected game. Dot now my code editor is complaining here. If I mouse over it, it says you can't use ng model right now. You can't bind. However, there's a recommendation here to import the forms module. Node modules, Angular. So we've got forms here. So I'm just going to accept that option to import the forms module, or you can use Alt-Shift-Enter. So mouse over the error, and at the bottom left, there's a little blue link that says import forms module. So I'm going to add that reference, and now my ng model is valid. I want a second field set with the label title. A second input with ng model. And now if I hit selected game dot, my code hinting gives me my title property. So we want to click on any element in the list and have it automatically populate into our form. Here's one of the cool things about Angular. Our form doesn't actually need a save button in this case. The data will change as we type it in real time. So there's our form. We now need to change our list so that when we click on any item in the list, that game is passed to as it becomes our selected game. And it populates and displays our form down below. So we want to add something in our LI. In our LI, we want to add a click event. So it's not just a regular JavaScript click event, it's an Angular, the event's being handled by our Angular component. Handled. That's how you say handled by Angular. I just made a new word, it's handled. So we have a click event, and in here what we want to do when it's clicked is we want to select this particular game. Now it's complaining because there is no onSelect method in our component right now. We're going to have to create this method that will track which game is clicked, set that as our selected game attribute, that then displays and populates a little form down below. So if I say create method on select, I'll try letting WebStorm write the method for me. I'll just select this. So it automatically creates an onSelect method in my component. So we just say this dot selected game equals game. So now if we click any game, That object is passed and becomes our selected game. Our form should display, and it should have the values, the ID and title. So I'll save that. I'll come back here, and if I, gotta wait till it refreshes. It's a little too quick. And now if I click, my form opens, and it automatically populates my ID and title. No reload. That NG if, it's always watching for a selected game. So now if I want to change the name, here's the two-way data binding. Right? As soon as I make a change, notice my list. It's updating in real time. Because Angular is always watching that NG model. They're both bound to the same thing. They're both bound to that title property of this object. So if I change one, it changes the other. So things are updating in real time. Well, and it's opinionated. You got to follow their rules. They're very specific about how they want you to do things, which some developers don't like, right? Or maybe the way Angular wants them to do things doesn't fit well with what the application needs are. In that case, React might be a better option. One other thing we can do with this, there's no indication we can actually click on these. So let's add a little CSS so that when we mouse over one of these, we get some indicator that this is selectable. So on my LI, let's add a class here as well. We'll add on my LI class, we'll add a game class. And then we can define this class in our style sheet. Give it a class of game. And then in my app.component.css, we'll go down to the bottom below all of the boilerplate CSS. So I'm going to create a .game class. I'm going to set the cursor to a pointer. Actually, I'm going to do it this way. And we'll also say game. If you hover over it, we'll set the text decoration to underline. And the color to some kind of blue. So when you hover over, you get the pointer. And you get the font, the color changes, and you get the underline effect. So now we get this. Click. So there's our CSS for it. if we want to make, so our form looks a little wonky, if we want to make these labels the same width, I could also put a class on these labels and set them to a standard width. So my text box is aligned. So I'll maybe do that in here. I'll give this a class of game label, and then we can define that in our CSS as well. We'll maybe make the font bold and we'll set it as a standard width. So I've applied that in my form. But notice also how that ngIf works. Every time our page reloads, we have no selected game, so the form automatically disappears. So in my CSS, I'll just define a book label for a game label class. We'll set a width of 50 pixels. We'll use inline block as the display. And I'll set the font weight to bold. So those labels will have a standard size. It'll align our text boxes, and our label text will also be bold. And the form looks a little better. Bold labels. They're standard width. So there's our two-way data binding in action. So Angular manages the state of each property in real time and can update it. So if we go back to the example I mentioned at the beginning of the class, something like a shopping cart, we can update our cart and the values can retotal on the fly. All of the other assets do not have to be reloaded. It reduces bandwidth, the user gets a better experience, they can interact with our site more quickly because they're not waiting for things to load. So users can update data and they can see the results of that data immediately. Does anybody have any questions so far? So the ng model was read, it was unrecognized until I accepted the code hint to import the Angular Forms module. ng model will not work without that. I'm going to check something. So I'll show you where we are going with this, what this is gonna look like when we integrate it with the rest of the stack, right? Because this is Angular only. So we've done Node and Express and Mongo, we've done Angular. What does it look like when we put them all together? Ultimately, let's see. We can kind of look under the hood and we'll basically be doing something similar. So here's what the structure is going to look like. We're still going to use the Express generator to build our Node shell. And then it gets broken into two separate components. So our server, this is our MVC backend. We still have our models. The models are going to be unchanged. But if you look at our controller, so in this case, we did cars. This is from last year. So here are our controller methods. So Tolu, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier. So we're not actually rendering any views. All we're doing is working with JSON. JSON in and JSON out for our create, read, update, and delete. The whole front end will go inside the client folder, and we'll use the Angular CLI inside of here, inside our client folder. And in here, we're going to have our source with our app. And in this case, we had a car component. So our car component does, it renders our, so here's most of the code. We defined a car class, just like we did with a game class today. And we had add, delete, update, and get methods. And those methods call our API in the back end. So Angular introduces another, actually 2 layers, because we'll have both a component layer and then we have a service layer. So we'll look at this. I think we'll start this next week. We may be able to do it in a single class, but if not, we've got more time in week 12. And if we finish it next week, we can do some more things with it in our final class. But this is where we're going. So we'll need this service that calls our Node API. Okay, I'm going to push everything from today up